All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new to the show today. All the rest of y'all, you know the deal. What's going on? How was your week? Yeah? That's good. Me? Oh, well, I had a pretty wonderful week, actually, on so many levels. First, my wife and 2 daughters left me alone. No, that's not what made it wonderful. I actually missed them quite a bit. But my wife took my 2 daughters to my in-laws and gave me a pass. She said I could stay home, mostly because I was working on a bunch of projects, like working on the back fence. I'm putting up a fence in our backyard and like doing a bunch of stuff. And I think she also just intuitively knew that I might really benefit from some solitude, which is very rare after you become a parent. Most parents out there know what I'm talking about. You lose all of this solitude time you once had because the kids just take up all the space that used to be there for that. So in any case, my wife took my 2 daughters away and I have had the house all to myself all week long. And it's such an interesting thing because recently on this show and just in general in conversation with my fellow teachers and friends, a lot of the conversation is around community and wanting to get back together again and how much yoga is about community. And then this week, I was all by myself almost the whole week. And actually, I realized how much my yoga is about solitude, that ultimately it all started with me being alone by myself. And then something that happens in that space becomes the basis on which I want to then connect with the people around me and the world around me. But it definitely starts from a place of solitude and feeling okay in solitude. And, that is actually something that we will talk about today some in my conversation with Brian Cooper, which I will tell you about in just a bit. But first, there's another reason why this week was quite wonderful for me, and it's about community. It's not about solitude. You see, I had all this time in solitude, but then also this week was the week we had our community-wide yard sale. Some of you, if you've been listening for long enough, might remember I talked about how I wanted to meet my neighbors, so I went to my local neighborhood association meeting and ended up getting voted into the board as the communications director. Well, before the pandemic hit, I set up a website for them and did some stuff for the organization. And then over the last year and a half, things have largely devolved. A number of the board members had left, and me and one other board member are sort of like holding the pieces together of the neighborhood association. And usually every year, one of the big events for the neighborhood association is a community-wide yard sale where within a square mile, a bunch of us all have yard sales on the same day. And they didn't have the yard sale last year for obvious reasons, but this year, at least right now, all the restrictions are lifted. And so I asked the other board member, do you think we could do the yard sale? And he said, I don't think so. It usually takes like a committee of people and there's like hours and hours of planning and admin. And I said, well, maybe I could just do it. All we really need to do is have a way for people to register, pay their $10 fee, put it all into a Google map, and then distribute the yard signs that says they're participating. Isn't that really what it all boils down to? I could do that myself. And so he said, go for it. And I, over the last 2 months, organized this community-wide yard sale. First, I sent out a doodle poll, and 42 of my neighbors responded, and 36 of us all agreed on the same day. So I said, okay, we're doing it on this day. And in the end, we ended up having 52 houses participate. And then a whole bunch of other houses who didn't even register ended up putting their stuff out too. And it was pretty incredible. It happened yesterday. I was out there. I got out there at like 7:30 and started setting up. And there was already like a crowd in my neighbor's yard. And I've just never seen so many people on my street before. I don't know what it was. Maybe people just have been pent up at home. Seemed to me there's a whole subculture of yard sailors who like have apps and they tell people, hey, there's all these yard sales going on. And there's like professional yard sale people, you could tell. And I just sat out there for hours talking to people and selling shit that was in my attic previously. And ultimately, it really was fantastic. It felt so good to be outside on my stoop talking to people. And something about that combination of having the solitude of my wife and daughters leaving and then having this event of like talking to all these people in my neighborhood, that felt like a pretty good formula for countering all the other things that have been happening that have been infecting my brain. And so in any case, I share all of that because that feels to me like what the yoga equation is, right? We spend some time in ourselves so that we can then be together with others. And that is absolutely what my conversation with Brian Cooper today pertains to. Brian Cooper started the Yoga Alliance Professionals UK, soon to be just Yoga Professionals UK. And we talk about that some, the name. And ultimately, I didn't know much about Brian. I had heard about the organization and how it was really some people in the UK who were looking to raise yoga teaching standards. And I have to say, I enjoyed getting to meet Brian very much. I intend to have him back on the show again. And not only do we talk about teacher training standards and how yoga gets imparted from one person to another, but we also talk about some stuff that's personal to me. I don't know if you were here last week. I was talking with Frank Jude Boccio about whether or not there's a mystical realm or not. Well, we ultimately talk a little bit about that at the end here, me and Brian too. And I just couldn't have enjoyed this conversation more. I've been thinking about it since I had it. I'm so glad that you will get to hear it today. Real quick before we do, I mentioned that in order to do the yard sale in my neighborhood, we needed a way for people to pay their $10 fee. Well, the reason I know how to do that is because if you're a yoga teacher like me who's been having to do your own yoga classes out of your own living room, essentially, you've needed a way to bill people to do that. And there's lots of different ways to do it. Sometimes, like, your website server has got a built-in thing. And, you know, there's all these people who want to sell you on ways of taking people's payments. For me, I have ended up going with Moonclerk. And Moonclerk is a way of doing recurring and one-time payments that I just think it's easier, it's cleaner, and it puts me more in the driver's seat, which is a much longer conversation, which we have every week in my yoga business class. But longer story short, you need a way to do billing where you get to be in charge and nobody can screw you later. And I think of all the different services that I've tried, Moonclerk is by far the best. I want to encourage you to check it out. And you can do me a favor by letting them know that I'm sending you by going to jbrownyoga.com/Moonclerk. That's jbrownyoga.com/MOONCLERK, jbrownyoga.com/Moonclerk. Let me also mention that this episode is brought to you in support by Podcast Premium subscribers. People like Mary Elise Adams Mercado and Lynn Boardman. Thank you so much, Mary Elise and Lynn, and to all of our other Podcast Premium subscribers. we really couldn't be doing this the way we are if it wasn't for the support of people like you. If you have been listening to the show and you want to have access to the full archives, or you just want to help be a supporter, becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber is the way to do that. It's a choose your rate. You can cancel at any time. And if you don't have any money right now, all you do is send us an email and we will give you a free account, no questions asked. But if you are in a position to contribute some, it makes a huge difference. It's what allows like an independent media like this to exist. So thank you to everybody who's doing that. You can find out about becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber, along with all of my other stuff, that yoga business class I was talking about, as well as my ongoing live stream classes and teachers call. All of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think it's good. You know, my wife and daughters are getting back in like a few hours. So I'm still in my solitude zone for a little bit longer. And I will touch base with you in that on the other side. So let's do it. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Brian Cooper. Hello, is anyone there?
Hello, Jay. It's Brian here.
Very, very good. Hello, sir. Good to meet you.
Yeah, and you too.
And I appreciate you giving me some of your time.
Yeah, well, you're welcome.
And, you know, it's interesting to me because just for anybody who's listening to this, and just so you know, I am already recording, that, you know, over the years, I've had many, many conversations about like people attempting to create trade organizations for yoga teachers. Mm-hmm. And I've been the vocal critic of the Yoga Alliance over the years. And for a while now, I've just kind of left that conversation, you know, like I just talking about the politics of yoga teacher training organizations were really just not feeling like a fruitful thing that I was doing. And more recently, I was having some conversations with people and they were talking about, well, there is still potential value for having such a thing. And, you know, what kind of, could we imagine other alternatives? And on that call were friends of mine from the UK, and they're like, oh, well, it's different for us over here than it is for those of you over there. We've got some options over here. And Yoga Alliance professionals, and then there's another one, independent, something that came up. And that happened sort of in coincidence with the email I got about you. And I thought, oh, there was like a little synchronicity there. And so I was just curious to get to talk to you today. But as I said, I don't want to get too into like areas of politics that I don't find useful. And I really am interested in like the substantive questions of what's best for yoga in terms of passing it on to generations after and developing teachers. So I'm saying all of that as a long-winded preface because I want to get to something more than just the history of you starting the organization, but I feel like we need to start there because people listening and myself don't really know the history so much. So maybe you'll fill us in some.
Sure. Yes, I'll try and keep it brief though, because I actually find it quite boring.
Yes, me too. That's the thing. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time just you giving us bio stuff about the organization, but I feel like we need to do a little bit. So maybe you can just give us the basic bullet points of the organization, like why, when you started it and why you started it.
Right. I mean, the main reason that it was started was mainly because of standards, teaching standards, which seem to be, from my point of view as a teacher trainer, seem to be falling quite rapidly. And I did look around a little bit at the various options available for, as you call them, trade organizations. And the only one that was available in Britain really at the time was called the British Wheel of Yoga. And they were sort of posing as they called it a governing body, which has got no legal status, and was really actually quite a deceptive message. And anyway, one of the big things that got people upset was that the fitness industry in Britain wanted to take over yoga. They wanted to start setting standards and regulations, and fitness industry doesn't really fit in all that well with yoga. So there was a lot of resistance, and this organisation, the British Wheel, were involved. They were with the fitness industry. They wanted to push ahead with it. So Yoga Alliance UK, as it was called, was set up basically as a counter organisation to what the British Wheel were doing. Then once it got set up, and I'm not going into the long story why it's called Yoga Alliance UK. There's been a lot of controversy about it. There are good reasons for it, historical reasons. But then I started looking into the actual standards of Yoga Alliance in the States, and I was quite genuinely shocked when I found that you could have done a teacher training course, and 2 years later, you could set yourself up as a trainer and be accredited by Yoga Alliance. 2 years. I mean, I practiced yoga for 30 years before I became a teacher. And then I taught for over 10 years before I even dreamt of becoming a trainer. And here are people becoming trainers after 2 years. I mean, it's unthinkable. So the organization was really set up to put that standards much higher. And just very briefly, that meant you needed a minimum of 8 years before you were allowed to, apply as a trainer. And that's really how we started. Of course, we're a tiny organization compared to the United States, the Yoga Alliance, tiny. But in a way, that's good because it means that we are only accepting people with what we consider pretty good standards. And we're quite happy to do that and not just be, raking in thousands and thousands of training courses. I don't think that's a very ethical way to go about it.
So I was just going to say, because I did see that, there's this one note on the on the website that mentions a conversation you had with the CEO of Yoga Alliance in 2006. And I do remember the Yoga Alliance in 2006. I opened a center and started a training program. That was after 10 years of teaching myself as well. I did that in 2007. And so I remember the organization at that time. I remember getting in an argument with the CEO in 2009, at an IAYT conference. So, especially in 2006, especially like when I started in 2007, I really do think the organization was even more of a sham than it might be now, because it really was just a rubber stamp. And I wasn't registered as a training program there or a teacher for a number of years, maybe 2 years after opening the center, because I just didn't believe in the organization. But at some point there was a pressure, like a market pressure. And I did go ahead and do it because I didn't want to put the people who were training with me at a disadvantage.
Sure. Yeah. I think this is what happens. I've talked to lots of, well-known yoga teachers, and they've all signed up with Yoga Alliance, and on the basis, basically, what you've just said, it's that, that's a recognized stamp, and it's recognized all over the world, so I don't want to deny my students when they graduate that stamp. So everybody just agrees, and,
I know. Well, it goes. I guess the other thing about it for me is, and you just pointed it out when you drew one distinction. I know there's more distinctions between what the organization that you founded and Yoga Alliance has done. And that is simply just in terms of time frames, like the problem became when we created a 200-hour foundational yoga teacher training. And then there was some sort of assumption that was a foundation enough to teach. And to say, even just to say, oh, it doesn't make sense for someone to be a registered yoga teacher training after only 2 years. They should have to be teaching for at least 8 years. Even just that as a protocol, I think would have an impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. It slows the whole process down in a sense. And it's nothing like myself. My time frame is probably unrealistic.
well, that's another point that I want to make, because I'm friends with Scott Johnson, who's sort of like my generation. I consider him seems like the torch holder of like the UK Ashtanga adopters. Like I think you were part of, maybe, there's John Scott and like that crew, and Hamish, or like these guys. I mean, there was girls too, who were sort of early adopters of Ashtanga in the UK. Am I right that you were sort of part of that group?
Yeah, I was. And I trained with Derek Ireland, who was really one of the key teachers. He taught a lot of people like John Scott and Hamish Henry and many others. That was that particular generation. I have to say that I was older when I started Ashtanga. I think I was in my 40s when I started Ashtanga. And then I went, it's interesting as an aside, you hear about age and stuff, but I've been doing yoga a long time, but I started when I don't remember exactly my age, but I certainly was in my 40s.
Oh.
And I went to Mysore and stayed there for 5 months, and I did first and second series with Pattabhi Jois. I can't honestly say my age was a barrier at all. It didn't seem to make much difference. So people like Hamish were certainly younger than me. They were like a younger generation. But we all trained under the sort of same, very similar, guidance.
I mean, just to say, like, I have done some Ashtanga practice in my time, and I mean, first and second series is a pretty physically demanding practice. And I'm 40. I turned 49 like 3 days ago. And I don't know that, like, I think it served me in my 20s, but I'm surprised. I mean, I do think that there's a difference in age between somebody in their 40s and someone in their 20s and what their practice should look like. Do you disagree?
No, I don't disagree. I think it's just because I had already been doing yoga for such a long time. When I came to Ashtanga, to be honest, it wasn't that challenging. Bits of it were.
So what were you doing before Ashtanga? When did it start for you then? If it didn't start with Ashtanga?
I started yoga when I was about 20, I'm not sure exactly, 21 maybe. Mm-hmm. And I basically learned from a book. And that's another thing which I'm not saying everybody should follow.
Well, what was your book? What was your book?
The first book, I can't actually remember. It was a paperback, and I picked it up at a party, and I went home, wherever I was living at the time, and I looked at it, and I'd already been doing a sort of yoga without knowing it. My favorite thing in the morning when I got up, when I was in my late teens, in those bad old days, was to sit in a big armchair with a cup of tea on one arm and a roll up, a tin of tobacco on the other, roll a cigarette and have tea and a cigarette, which was my way of starting the morning. But at the same time, I used to play around sitting in that chair, putting my leg behind my head. And I don't know why I did it. I just did it. So when I picked up this book and I saw, oh, look, there's somebody with their leg behind their head. That's what I do. The difference is I put it on an armchair and they were doing it on the floor. But basically, that's how I started. And then I did get various bigger books. I do remember Swami Vishnu Devananda's book.
Yes, the illustrated, all the black and white photos, the big page photos, right?
Yeah, and I just worked through it, and I literally would just open it somewhere, do the posture, copy it, then move on to the next. And by the time, maybe after about a year, I was doing a sort of very strange practice of cramming about 40 asanas into my practice very quickly, one after the other.
Just get it done. This one, then this one, then this one, then this one. Just like the pages, like you're flipping the pages, right?
And that's how, and I know I said, oh, I've only got 10 more minutes. I'll try and do another 3 in that time. Let's get another one. And oh, look, there's a new one. I'm going to try that one. And that's how I practiced for quite a long time. I never went to a yoga class. My first yoga class ever was actually when I did teacher training in Grass Valley in California.
When was that?
Ages ago. Honestly, I'm not very good with time.
I understand. But were you? So you started your first ever time going to an actual teacher's class was a teacher training. Is that what you just said?
Yeah. So I'd never been to a class because the idea of me going to a yoga class was just unthinkable. I just couldn't see myself doing it, and that's one of the things. I guess maybe my perspective on it was very much yoga is a very personal, private thing. I don't mean that in a sort of precious way, but it's just something I did for myself. I wasn't really interested in doing it with other people. I never quite understood why I'd want to go and practice yoga with other people.
I think that's to interject for just a second. I think it's an interesting point, one that I have observed as well, just in coming to understand yoga, that this modern group yoga class, it's a very new phenomena, actually. And that for like a long time, that's not the way yoga was imparted. And that very often you would see your teacher once in a while. And most of the time you were just practicing by yourself at home, as you described.
Yeah. And also, of course, if you were in India and you went to, let's call, for the sake of argument, a traditional teacher, people in the shala or wherever weren't all doing the same thing. So they would have their own personal sort of sequence of practice to do, and the teacher would come around and check and maybe give them a new posture. That was the way it was done, and it still is done in many places. So the idea of teaching a whole class as a group is, I don't know who introduced it. I'm sure it's been around quite a long time. But obviously, if you think of Iyengar and these enormous classes he would hold in various venues, then you get an idea of people all practicing in sync, and I guess similarly, obviously with Ashtanga, people practicing literally synchronized with each other, and that's one approach, but it's not the only approach.
Well, I think that's interesting that you say that, because when those teachers came to the West, I've seen video of, I guess not as much Iyengar, but certainly Pattabhi Jois, like counting off the breaths and everybody going to him, like a lead primary or whatever. All right. So what was this training that you did? It was in California, you said?
Yeah, that was a Shivananda training. And Vishnu Devananda was still around at that time. Maybe that helps to get a date, because I can't remember. But I know he's still around.
I mean, I was a kid in the 80s in California. I grew up in Los Angeles in the suburbs. So I was there, but I wasn't doing what you were doing, So what was that like? What was that experience of going from the UK to California to train in Shivananda, having only practiced out of the book?
Well, no, I was working in the States. I was working in just south of LA, at Riverside, at the university there. So I basically left my job and headed up to Grass Valley. I don't really know how I decided on it.
So what was that decision about? Why would you give up a decent job to go to do some crazy yoga stuff? Because at that time, it was not in the pop culture. Like it was it was still underground when I got to it in like the early 90s. Yeah,
because basically I don't remember, I last counted, I've had at least 36 different jobs, and probably more. I was always starting a job, and then after 6 or 7 or whatever months, I would leave, and often I would go traveling and I'd come back and so on and so on. And I've done so many jobs, and this job I had down at the University of California, it wasn't going too well. And when I left, I decided, the one thing that I do consistently in my life, or have been doing for many years, is yoga. And I just thought, why don't I actually try and make yoga not just what I do every day, but actually a way of living? or earning a living. And that's where the idea came.
So then it makes sense. You're like, okay, well, what's the first thing you do is get trained properly or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I have to say that, there's many different views about Shivananda. I've also got views about it. But I have to say the training at the time, there were 10 people on the course. And I thought it was a wonderful course. I really have to give them credit.
There was no 200-hour structure to it, I'm sure.
No, it was a 1 month residential. I had no idea the hours involved. I think they were quite long days. I remember that.
Right.
No, there was no 200-hour or any 100-hour. It was just, there's the training. It's 4 weeks. And then, I stayed in Grass Valley actually and started teaching at the ashram. So I started practicing teaching.
Okay. So how long were you at the ashram after your training?
Well, not long. I can't remember. It was a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. I really don't remember.
All right. So then what do you do? Where do you go after that?
It's a long story. I won't go into it because I probably can't even completely remember.
Well, eventually you come back to the UK and start a trade organization for yoga teachers, or no, you come back and you get into Ashtanga. So how does that happen? How do you go from doing Shivananda? Do you try any other styles before you get to Ashtanga? Did you do your own Iyengar explorations too, like everybody else?
Sure. This is the thing. Again, it's sort of complicated, but I ended up in Germany for various reasons, and I started teaching in Germany. And I also met a very, very senior Iyengar teacher who was teaching in Frankfurt. And so I started going to Iyengar classes, and I learned a huge amount from that teacher, my teacher. And I was also, as I said, started teaching, and I was teaching mainly Ashtanga. I wasn't.
So wait, once you were in Germany and you were studying Iyengar, you weren't teaching Shivananda. Did you switch to Iyengar?
I didn't teach Shivananda, but I did at some point, which I can't remember when, I did live in the Shivananda ashram in London, and there I was teaching Shivananda as one must.
Yes, the eye rolls and the Shavasana, right?
Yeah,
see, that's the interesting thing. That's the switch, because I think a lot of people did that. That was the big three. There was Shivananda and Iyengar, and then Ashtanga became the kind of craze at one point. And I think a lot of people wanted to that we tried them all out.
Sure. Yeah.
And there's distinct signatures to them, I would say, at least when I took them. Like they had, like I said, like Shivananda had the eye rolls and the Shavasanas, and Iyengar was definitely alignment oriented. It was all about the alignments. And Ashtanga was the series.
Yeah.
So what was the appeal to you to make Ashtanga more of a focus, or is that just how it happened?
I think it's just how it happened, but certainly after I'd been to Derek, Ireland, I was in India when he was teaching in India, in Goa. That became my practice, and then that's all I did. I practiced Ashtanga. I guess 6 days a week as usual, but for many, many years.
Well,
that's all.
In a way, it ties back to something you said earlier, because that's what I liked about Ashtanga, was that it was a set sequence that I learned and just did on my own. And even now, my practice, even though it's not Ashtanga, I have that. Like I have a sequence. I don't have to stick to it, but I like the repetition like that. And it helped me as a disciplinary tool for self-practice, which is where you started as, with you and your book. So it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. No, there's a great deal to be said for Ashtanga. I mean, it's got its pitfalls as well, depending on the type of personality you are. You can become a little bit obsessive about completing theories and so on. I mean,
I would be remiss if I didn't at least bring up the fact that Shivananda just had a recent expose, and we all know, and I've had many conversations on this show about Pattabhi Jois and all of that. I don't think we need to rehash that so much, but whenever I'm speaking to someone of your generation who I do see is like the one before me, And I would say the people who I see like yourself, who've just like quietly held it down all these years, I have to ask, how do you think we reconcile that, what I think is significant shift? Like in the times that we're talking about right now, these figures, Pattabhi Jois, Mr. Iyengar, the Shivananda gurus, they were the masters, they were revered. And now it has been revealed that these supposed yoga masters were certainly, to say the least, not infallible and at worst abusive. As you said, this is probably not, it's been talked about so much. My own take on it is that if you put someone up on a pedestal, then you're going to expect trouble. And that was part of the problem. I'm not exonerating them at all, not in the least. But this is when I was in Mysore, I watched people who I thought were what I would have called grown-up men and women behaving like children, giving this sort of, holding Pattabhi Jois in awe. And I never understood it. And I was never part of this sort of clique. And similarly with Shivananda, there were gurus, and I met quite a few of them, who for me were just regular guys. I didn't hold them in any esteem particularly. Iyengar for me is a little bit different, I have to say. I still have quite a lot of respect for Iyengar. But I think this is a problem. If you go to yoga and you're expecting maybe more than somebody can give, you tend to project things into them and see all sorts of wonderful things, and then at some point the bubble bursts. I think that's true. I think they also did fucked up shit, forgive my language. It has to be acknowledged too. I agree. And I think that I've always said that in all the conversations I've had on this topic about the following of the gurus, it always seems to me that if someone's like sense of yoga or like the gift of yoga is sort of coming from some sort of external person or authority, and then that external person or authority is shown to not be what you thought they were, your sort of world is shattered. However, if it's not coming from that, if it's from within you and nobody else can touch it, then as painful as it is and as confusing as it is when a teacher of yours ends up not living up to what you would hope they would be, it's still didn't destroy yoga for me, it allowed me to actually have to go into myself and my practice deeper,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I guess that does bring us a little bit back more to where we started, because that experience that you described of having your practice over time and meeting these teachers and even seeing the things that you saw going on, that's like the early foreshadowing of Instagram and shit. You know what I mean? Like people, and other horrible things that have happened since in terms of just the profiting and the fetishization of yoga. And that inherently involves the teacher training, because that did become like the business model. Like initially, a lot of people, I think, were very well intentioned, and they were in your generation, and they were like, we're going to bring yoga to the masses. People need yoga. This will help the world. I think many of us believe that still. However, the process of bringing it to the masses was successful, and it was done in kind of like a capitalistic way through marketing and branding and stuff.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously it's
well, I mean, my question to you is, you obviously watched it as I did, and we rode the wave of it too. Like, I imagine you have been teaching and making money off it all these years. So we've certainly benefited from like a yoga boom.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm not denying it. Absolutely. Yeah. I completely. But I guess it depends on, I hate to use these words like integrity and all that stuff, but it is a little bit to do with that.
Why do you hate to use the word integrity? Why? Integrity, yes. Integrity, authenticity, right?
Yeah, it's just because it can be a bit overused.
Yeah.
And words are easy to pronounce, but, do they carry much meaning or, how real are they? So, I'm always a bit skeptical. But, I guess I have to use that word, integrity, and quality. Because quality to me is quite a big deal in yoga or anything. And sometimes I think maybe quality suffers quite a bit in yoga.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.